Kostya Kennedy, welcome back to the Baseball Bookshelf Conversation.
Great to be on with you. I love this conversation.
I was just thinking, Saturday Night Live has like special jackets for hosts who appear like 5 times, and if I'm not mistaken, this is your third time on, so we got to do something. We got to start maybe a hat or something.
Oh, it sounds good to me. I love it.
So your the first baseball book we talked about was your book on Joe DiMaggio. The next one was Pete Rose, and now this one, which is very timely because we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's debut, is called True: The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson. And one of the things I really liked about it, one of the things I personally liked about it, is very nostalgic for me because my family comes from Montreal, and I know all the places, all the areas that you talk about, and I can picture them in my mind, even though I'm not obviously old enough to have seen him play. Although my mother used to say that she saw him play, even though she was no big baseball fan. Jarry Park was like a stone's throw from my aunt's house in Outremont. So I used to walk over there whenever I was visiting and the Expos were playing in town. So how long ago did you start working on this one?
Well, it's great to hear that connection to Montreal, which is right at the heart of that first section of the book. It's one of the books that has, I've sort of been gathering string on it for many years in a way, just since I was a kid, I had an interest in Jackie Robinson. And then in my job at Sports Illustrated, maybe 8, 10 years ago or so, I did a story on Rachel Robinson. And at that point, just as you and many other people, I was of course familiar with the outlines, the broad outlines of Robinson's story. Doing that piece on Rachel really began getting me thinking about a way to do the story and to try to do it in a little bit of a different way and shed some new light. But I only really started working on it about 2 years ago, 2 years before it came out. That's when I really put it down. But as I said, I've sort of been collecting stuff, meaning actually writing some down, and also just making mental notes for some time.
Now, the book is broken down into 4 seasons: spring 1946, when he was with the Montreal Royals, summer of 1949, autumn 1956, and winter 1973. Why did you pick, 1946 is an obvious choice, but why did you pick the other 3 years for those seasons?
Yeah, so I mean, just quickly for readers who might not have seen it, but so the seasons are those 4 years, as you're saying, Ron, specifically, and also figuratively or metaphorically the spring, summer, autumn, and winter of Robinson's public and athletic life. So I felt that I mentioned that because I feel like in some ways they represent that. So 1949, which was not only the year where he sort of stopped turning the other cheek and became Robinson and Fuller, the ball player, but he was the best baseball player alive. Now he had several other very, very good seasons. But in 1949 was this sort of moment, again, a figurative summer of his life, certainly an athletic life, when he's the best baseball player alive. Of course, he wins MVP that year. And even by today's metrics, by war measurement and other things, he was the best player in baseball. And so to see him there, sort of astride the sports world, I felt like I could sort of take care of a lot by looking at that year a little more in depth. There was also the All-Star game was at Ebbets Field, which was he and other teammates were the first Black players on an All-Star team. And it just, I thought it was a way to sort of crystallize Robinson in Brooklyn, sort of changing the landscape the way he did without necessarily having to go through year by year, blow by blow, what happened throughout the middle of his career.
And in 1956?
Similarly, again, with the autumn metaphor, we see him at the end of his career. So that's his last season. It became appealing to me as I was thinking about it, how 1955 obviously is an important year in Dodger fan history and in baseball history. The one year when Brooklyn beat the Yankees in the World Series. It was a really tough year for for Robinson on the field and in general, he was, quite a faded ball player from what he had been in 55. In 56, he didn't go back to being the superstar that he was, but he really had this sort of valiant resurgence where he became quite a productive player. And there was something appealing about this sort of show of will on his part. And also to see him sort of, looking ahead to his life after baseball. He was obviously, with the Dodgers every day, but he was also had begun to be in contact with Martin Luther King. That was the year he received the Spingarn Medal from the NAACP, which goes to an African American person who changes the culture or does something significant to advance the African American cause. It had never gone to an athlete before, first time. So there were a lot of reasons to look at that year specifically, again, as sort of a way to tell the story of this part of Robinson. I think we see in each year, or at least I felt this doing it. Of course, he's the same person, and there's a lot of consistency in his approach and his manner. But there's also, we're seeing a different person. We're seeing a very young guy, and then 10 years later, a lot has changed. Last thing on this in his life, and also in America and in the world. When Jackie breaks into Montreal in 1946, Martin Luther King has not given a public sermon yet. We don't know him. And by 1956, when Robinson retires, we're in the middle of the Montgomery bus boycott. So that tells you a little bit about what has happened in that decade of American history, which I hope to be also part of where we were seeing Jackie Robinson in different stages, environmental stages.
And obviously 1973, we're coming to the end of his life.
Yes, so he died, of course, in October of 1972, but it was also a very important year in that, when he left baseball, he's pretty much out of the game. He didn't, I don't say quite estranged, but certainly distanced from the game. He had wanted a managerial position. That didn't work out. Then he never took a job or was offered a job sort of in public relations or front office or anything like that. He wasn't angry necessarily at the sport. And when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1962, he was very gracious. And a lot of his old friends from around baseball were there and were congratulatory, of course. But he was out of the game. And it was only in 1972, initially at Gil Hodges' funeral early on in that year, that he began to get repatriated to the Dodgers. He went out and appeared on the field in Los Angeles for the one and only time. And then famously at the World Series shortly before his death, he spoke on the field. So it was a very interesting year just in his sort of coming back to where he belonged, so to speak.
Now, naturally, Jackie Robinson was not just an athlete. He was a civil rights figure, which you write about quite a bit in the book. The award he won from the NAACP was something I was not aware of. How much of, I don't want to say impact, but you said an athlete had never won it before. What was the feeling that it was given to an athlete and not someone of more, for lack of a better word, importance?
Yeah, there were. It's a great question, and there was some sort of discussion in the African American newspapers and in the press and letters writing in. Some people thought it should have gone to Martin Luther King that year. King actually won it the following year. It was like any sort of best award. There was some controversy around it, but there was a lot of support for it because remember also this is long before Muhammad Ali, it's before Jim Brown became active. It was a different time when just Robinson being willing to sort of speak out at times on social issues, civil rights issues, something which, for instance, Roy Campanella didn't do, and athletes didn't really do it. Just doing that and his engagement, simple as fundraising for NAACP, simple as making appearances, went a long way. Of course, with acknowledging and rewarding him for what he had endured. It wasn't just sports in a way. Baseball was such a big deal, as we know, of course, at that time. It was such a big platform. So it was pretty clear, I think, and a lot of the discussion around it was that he was extending way beyond the boundaries of the sport.
Well, let's talk about the press for a minute. The mainstream press, how did they approach him when he was first coming up?
It was kind of I don't know if you can make a blanket statement. First thing to remember, of course, is that there was in those days a very active, and there still is, but more active, more prominent African American press involved covering Robinson, covering issues of concern. And then of course there was just simply more newspapers in general of all kinds. So I say that because you're getting a variety of opinions. I don't know if one can say the press thought this and thought that. Overall, I think the press was very welcome to have. It's a story a day, right? It makes your life great if you're covering Robinson. If you're looking for something to write about, it's interesting. He was, in addition to being this barrier breaker and taking this all on, he was an extraordinarily exciting and accomplished player. That said, there was definitely, sort of institutional resistance or sort of, I know, looking at it from the side eye a little bit. I talked a little bit about a baseball writers dinner when Jackie was coming up, where it's at the end of the dinner and the end of the year, and they have this dinner where there's typically a performance of some kind, and they did a whole series of skits in which Robinson is portrayed as a servant, and Branch Rickey is called master. I mean, just the most atrocious stuff that you can imagine going on. And it was just sort of part of a pretty sort of hidebound, all white writing class in the Baseball Writers Association at that time. So there was a little bit of a struggle at that point. And there were some writers, more prominently in the South, who were sort of actively resistant. That was a little less common in the North. It was more like what I just described. There was a sort of institutional prejudice. But there were some writers who were simply against it and thought that every time Jackie, got angry about a call or displayed emotion, which he did quite a bit in his career, that it was a bad representation and things like that. So it was really it kind of runs the gamut for the reaction to how people receive Robinson.
And as far as the black press goes, talk about a little bit about. I'm thinking about the representation of Wendell Smith in the movie 42. Would you say that was pretty accurate?
Yeah, I think it was pretty accurate, absolutely. And I don't spend a lot of time with Wendell Smith. He was really, really important in 1947, which is the year that I don't cover quite as much. And of course, he was important down in Florida. Yes, I think it was generally accurate. Wendell Smith, Sam Lacey, a few others who were there every day were critically important to chronicling Robinson and sort of keeping an eye out for what could go right and what could go wrong for him. So I think in general, Ron, 42 took some liberties, as you might expect, in terms of conflating time periods or putting two people next to each other that weren't actually next to each other, like the Pee Wee Reese, going over to him in the middle of the game kind of scene. But that's to be expected, and that makes it enjoyable in some ways from a movie perspective. But overall, it was quite accurate, I think.
I'm thinking at the beginning of the movie, I don't remember the exact terminology, but usually they say based on a true story. I think in this one it was inspired by a true story,
Oh,
which I think there's a difference somehow. To my mind, there's a difference.
yeah.
Talk about the importance of Red Barber in all this.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Red Barber, before he was from the South, and he'd grown up in a segregated environment and gone to school in a segregated environment. And at the time in the 40s, he of course went on to announce for the Yankees, but with the Dodgers, and he was really the voice of the Dodgers, coming out of the radio primarily, TV too, but most people were consuming out of the radio. And he was incredibly important to the Dodgers. Ricky noticed that one thing, their female audience grew, because Barber, he spoke with a bit of a Southern drawl and was very folksy in telling his stories. And he was also, I want to say, like a very early reporter, in the sense that in those days, broadcasters weren't really going down to talk to players, weren't advanced reporting before the game. What now we consider baseline, expectation, they weren't doing that much. Barber was. A couple of years before Robinson came up, Ricky went to Red Barber and said, listen, I'm going to bring in a black player, and I want you to know this. And if you're not comfortable with it, now's the time for you to leave. Because he knew it was kind of doing Barber a favor and doing the whole enterprise a favor. He knew that if he had brought Robinson up, or brought any African-American player up, and Barber had said quit, that wouldn't look good for anybody, would have been a wrench in the works. At first, Barber thought, you know what, I can't do this. I'm not familiar with this. He went, he talked to his wife, he famously said she poured him a martini, and they had a little something to drink, and then a couple of days later, he came back and he said, you know what, of course I can do this. I'm gonna call, he said he'd call the ball. And what he did was not mention Robinson's race per se. And that was a big, big move, so that you couldn't see that he looked any different on the ball field from that sense. And that was a really interesting decision to make. Later on, Robinson would be grateful, express gratitude towards Barber for how he handled it. And Barber, once he met Jackie Robinson, he was so humbled and regretful that he had ever had any resistance, and felt like he owed Jackie Robinson so much. The last thing I want to say about Barber is that, in those years, if you were a kid in Brooklyn, you maybe didn't know that much about segregation. People were self-segregated, living in their own neighborhoods, but there was no legalized segregation, and you weren't being taught it in school necessarily. So you wouldn't necessarily know about it. But Red Barber would say, when the Dodgers went to St. Louis, well, all the guys stayed at the Chase Hotel except for Jackie, and then maybe Roy Campanella or Newcomb or whoever was with the team in that particular year. They have to stay over at the other hotel. And one person in my book, Ira Glasser, who went on to be head of the ACLU, and he simply represents any number of people at that time. It was the first they were hearing about it. They were incensed. Are you kidding me? That's my guy. My guy can't stay in the hotel? What do you mean? I love Jackie Robinson. And so it was incredibly powerful way to get this message across without having to be didactic about it. Just simply tell it as it was, and people realize, especially young people, just how flat out wrong that treatment was.
One thing that sticks out in my mind from 42 about the actor John McKinney, I believe is his name, who played Red Barber, at one point he says, Jackie's definitely a brunette,
Ah,
which I thought was kind of funny. I want to talk more about the process of bringing this book out. You've obviously been writing for a long time. Both of your books, the DiMaggio book, the Pete Rose book, each won the Casey Award from Sitball Magazine, emblematic of the best baseball book of those years, 2011 and 2014, respectively. What do you find is there a difference in your process over the years, including in terms of how you write, in terms of the technology that's available to you for research? Talk about that a little bit, please.
So my process on the simple side of writing is I get up as early as I can stomach it to get up and try to get to work for as much time as I can put in. So on a physical sense, that's what I'm doing. That's how I'm structuring myself. I need to be really disciplined. Then, later in the day and throughout, I may be jotting down notes and things like that. And this came out by necessity, having a family or having a job. That's the time. And then it sort of developed into that's when I needed to be as well. The reporting is different in each of those books. The Rose is still alive, so that made it sort of in its own category. It was much more active. I certainly did have access to any number of databases, which I would, subscribe to, looking at old newspapers, looking at old documents. get what I could out of the Hall of Fame. In Robinson's case, there's some stuff at the Library of Congress. Looking around at things. In this book, and in some ways this is more similar to my DiMaggio book, which focused in 1941 and his hitting streak. There was a lot of stuff I just didn't go into, right? For Robinson, I sort of knew and assimilated a lot about his childhood, but I wasn't, for example, looking to recreate a day as when Robinson was 14, right? So the scene they're trying to bring to life, I had a little bit of guidance, self-imposed guidance as to when that would be. So that was helpful in a certain way. It also allowed me to spend a little more time on the detail of a particular game, knowing that it was representing some other thing. So yeah, I don't know if that answered well enough, but that's kind of how I went about things. And of course, speaking to anybody I could speak to, and I was fortunate enough to connect with people who were in Montreal in 1946 and who were in Brooklyn in 1949, and of course the other years as well.
How did you find the people from Montreal? Curious.
I had, so I knew Montreal a little bit. I used to cover hockey for Sports Illustrated. If you cover hockey for Sports Illustrated, you're going to spend a little time in Montreal. A colleague of mine, Michael Farber, is also a good friend, and he lived up in Montreal. So I started to have a little bit of a network. And this is just one example, but Mitch Melnick is a very popular radio host in Montreal. And his mom went to Lormier Downs to see, similarly you said your mom saw Jackie play. She went to see him play and could describe it. She actually had a picture that she had taken of him on the field in 1946. And with extremely, obviously an older woman, but wonderful in her recollection, able to describe stuff, correct me if I misspoke in a description of something. And then I was able to sort of get into, I got a little help from some reporters up there. A fellow who's extremely helpful named Dan Ziniuk, who is a reporter who's lived in Canada all his life. And I was able to get into the African-American community a little bit and find some people who had been at the Black church where Jackie and Rachel had gone, for example, and people who grew up and remembered that time when it came. It was a very heightened time period because in addition to everything else, it's the year after World War II. So they're still getting ration cards when Jackie's going up there. It's still very prevalent. It's a sort of heightened, exciting time, even though obviously Canada wasn't officially in the war. They were providing arms, and they were often a departure place for U.S. or Allied aircraft and boats to leave from. So yeah, I knocked on as many doors as I could find. Oh, tell me, can you connect me with anybody? And in every interview, I'm asking, connect me with somebody else until I run into a dead end.
The previous books on Rose and DiMaggio were published by Sports Illustrated, for whom you used to write. This one is from St. Martin's Press. How did you come to them as your publisher? And I imagine working with Sports Illustrated gets your foot in the door just by the fact that you're already working for them. But here you're kind of starting from scratch, it almost seems.
Yeah, it's good question. In all cases, I did try to shop out my book proposal to various publishers. Those books were published by Sports Illustrated, and more globally were published by the Alpha Time Inc. Books, which had a book publishing department, which doesn't exist anymore. So that was not there. And then, so I just simply, I did a proposal. One thing I do on, and this is as much for me as for trying to sell the book, it's also just for me to make sure this is a place I want to spend my time and energy, is I do a pretty sophisticated, or I should say developed proposal. Maybe it's 10,000 words in all, with a sample chapter and put a lot of thought into it, and try to make sure I'm, again, satisfying myself first of all. So I did that proposal and shopped it around, and ended up at St. Martin's. Very happily. It's been a wonderful experience working with them.
Now, I know when I published my books, I was given a target, a word count,
Mhm.
and the first draft is way excessive of the word count. I'm just curious, did you find that as well? And how it's always difficult to self-edit. Uh,
Yeah.
so
It's
I
a
know
hard,
people who start out, with for argument's sake, 150,000 words, and they have to pare it down to 100,000. So, did you find that kind of difficulty?
yeah, I did. Although I'm not sure exactly how at what point you do it. I kind of do it along the way, and I kind of have a sense of about it. You don't know exactly. Certainly a section or a portion could end up being much longer than you thought. Sometimes you get to something that you've been thinking about all the time. Oh, I'm going to say so much about it. It ends up being 2 paragraphs, and you're in, you're out, and that's it. Um, yeah, it's definitely couldn't agree more. It's a difficult, challenging thing to self-edit and to cut it down. I did it kind of along the way, so I didn't end up with sort of a big manuscript that then had to be cut by a lot. But along the way, I would certainly cut back sections regularly.
Well, we've been talking with Kostya Kennedy, author of the new book on Jackie Robinson, True, The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson. And if past is prelude, I'm sure this will be coming up for a great consideration for another Casey Award. So, Kostya, thank you so much for talking with us today, and continued good luck.
Ron, it's a pleasure to be on with you, and thanks so much for the good words, and good luck to you as well.